Bighorn Basin, Wyoming. August 1888. The heat was a hammer, beating the sagebrush into a brittle silver-gray dust that rose with every footfall. On a small, windswept claim overlooking the Greybull River, Balint Kovacs was building something that made no sense. It wasn't a cabin of peeled logs, notched and chinked with mud and moss in the time-honored way. It was a metal worm, a half-cylinder of corrugated iron sheets bolted together, lying on a low wooden platform, and the platform was on wheels. 4 heavy cast-iron wheels scavenged from a derelict sheep wagon. Crandall Pickersgill, the territorial stock inspector, reined in his horse, his face a mask of disbelief under the brim of his hat. He was a man of rules and right angles, of fences and brands and ledger books. What he saw violated every principle of frontier survival he knew. He watched as Kovacs, a quiet man with the wide-set eyes of someone used to vast, flat horizons, methodically packed a thick, wet mixture of mud and straw into the cavity between the outer iron shell and an inner one. "What in God's name is that, Kovacs?" Pickersgill called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of his office. 2 other homesteaders, Jedediah Stone and Amos Fry, had stopped their wagon to watch the spectacle. Balint looked up, wiped a smear of mud from his brow with the back of his wrist, and said simply, "My house." Amos Fry let out a short, sharp laugh. "A tin can on wheels? The first winter gale will roll that foolish thing clear to Nebraska." Jedediah Stone, a man who had lost 2 children to the diphtheria that followed the brutal winter of '86, just shook his head slowly. "It's a coffin, not a house. Iron draws the cold. You'll freeze solid in that contraption." Pickersgill's objection was more practical, more cutting. He swung a leg over his saddle and strode closer, his boots crunching on the dry soil. "I'm not sure you understand the Homestead Act, son," he said, his tone mixing pity with official censure. "You have to make improvements to the land, a permanent dwelling. That thing," he gestured with a gloved hand, "is a conveyance, a wagon. It has wheels. A house on wheels voids the improvement clause. You'll lose your claim." Balint Kovacs did not argue. He did not defend his methods. He just picked up another handful of the straw-clay mixture and pressed it into the wall. "It will be warm," he said, to no one in particular. As Pickersgill rode off with the others, he heard Amos Fry's parting shot drift back on the hot wind. Let him build his folly. The winter will teach him. The mockery was absolute. The judgment passed by men who knew the brutal arithmetic of a Wyoming winter. They knew what worked. Thick logs, a deep foundation, a massive stone hearth. This strange wheeled arch was an act of madness. What did this Hungarian tent maker, this outsider from a land of grass and sky, understand about the physics of wind that a century of American log cabin builders had missed? This channel is dedicated to uncovering the lost wisdom of those who survived against the odds. The story of Balint Kovacs is more than just a tale of a strange house. It's a masterclass in thermodynamics and the humility required to truly understand nature. Subscribe, and I promise you will learn precisely how a curved wall and a set of wheels defeated the killing power of a 40-mile-per-hour gale. What's the most unconventional solution to a problem you've ever seen work? Let us know in the comments. Balint Kovacs, his wife Ilona, and their 2 small children, Janos and Zsofia, had arrived in the Bighorn Basin 2 years prior. They had done what everyone else did. With the last of their savings, they built a small, tight log cabin, felling the trees themselves, chinking the gaps, until not a sliver of daylight showed through. They believed they were prepared. They were wrong. The first winter, that of 1886 to '87, was a thing of legend, a season of profound and relentless cold that broke the spirits of even the hardiest settlers. For the Kovacs family, it was a slow-motion catastrophe. Balint was not a carpenter. He was not a frontiersman. In his homeland on the great Hungarian plain, the Puszta, he had been a Sifra Seder maker. His hands knew the feel of canvas and leather, of ornate embroidery, and the precise tension of guy ropes. He had built the grand, decorated shelters for shepherds and horsemen, structures designed not to fight the endless wind of the plains, but to live with it, to turn and flex and shed its power like water off a duck's back. He knew fabric and tension, not timber and mass. His log cabin was a monument to his ignorance. The cold did not just seep in, it invaded. It was a physical presence. By January, the coffee pot on the stove had frozen to the iron surface overnight, its handle welded fast by a thick boss of ice. The thin mattresses on their beds, stuffed with dried grass, crackled like autumn leaves whenever they moved, the moisture of their breath having frozen deep inside the ticking. Ilona's favorite comb, carved from bone, developed black tips on its tines where it had touched the frost-furred interior wall. Their world shrank to the few feet of thawed air around the pot-bellied stove, a greedy beast that consumed wood at a terrifying rate. Balint spent his days fighting his way through deepening snow to cut more fuel, and his nights watching the fire, knowing that if it went out, the cold would claim them before morning. They survived, but barely. They emerged into the spring pale and thin, haunted by the memory of the cold's constant pressing siege. That winter didn't just chill Balint's body, it clarified his mind. The problem wasn't the cold. The cold was a constant. The problem was the house. The failure of the conventional cabin was not a mystery of the frontier. It was a simple, brutal law of physics. The standard American log cabin was, in aerodynamic terms, a disaster. It was a square-cornered, flat-walled box, planted defiantly in the path of the wind. When a 40-mile-per-hour gale, common in the Bighorn Basin, slammed into the windward wall of Jedediah Stone's cabin, it had nowhere to go. The air molecules piled up, creating a zone of immense positive pressure. This pressure was an invisible hydraulic press, seeking any point of weakness. It found every tiny gap in the chinking, every crack around the window frame, every space under the door. Through these openings, it injected jets of super-chilled air, air that felt not like a draft, but like a knife. Simultaneously, as the main body of wind flowed over and around the cabin, it created areas of strong negative pressure, a vacuum, on the leeward side and the roof. This vacuum acted like a giant suction pump, pulling warm air out of the cabin from the opposite side. The house was being attacked from both sides. Pressurized cold air forced in, and precious warm air vacuumed out. The result was a catastrophic rate of air exchange. The family inside wasn't just fighting the cold outside. They were trying to heat the entire state of Wyoming as it passed directly through their living space. A frontiersman's answer to this was always the same: more. More wood on the fire, more mud in the chinking, more blankets nailed to the walls. They fought pressure with mass. They burned through cords of wood, their stoves glowing red hot, yet the floors remained freezing and ice crystals formed on the nail heads inside the walls. They were in an arms race against fluid dynamics, and they were losing. The flickering candle on the table, its flame bent sideways by the draft from a supposedly sealed wall, was a perfect illustration of their predicament. They lived inside a leaky engine, burning fuel with terrible inefficiency, the constant roar of the wind a testament to the power they were trying and failing to block. Balint Kovacs, having survived one winter inside this failed experiment, knew he would not survive another. He would not fight the wind with brute force. He would yield to it. The construction of what the locals called Kovac's folly began in the late summer of 1888. It was an exercise in methodical scavenging and radical repurposing. The 4 cast iron wheels and their sturdy axles were the first acquisition, traded from a sheep herder for Balint's last 2 good knives from the old country. He built a low, heavy platform of cottonwood planks, 10 feet wide and 16 feet long, bolted directly to the axles. This was his foundation, a foundation that could move. The corrugated iron sheets came from the derelict supply depot at Fort McKinney, bought for pennies a pound as scrap. They were rusted, bent. Some even had bullet holes, but they were strong. Balint spent a week hammering them straight, patching the holes with smaller pieces of tin and rivets. Then came the most crucial part, bending them. He built a simple jig, a curved form made of stacked logs, and day after day, he and Ilona used their combined weight and a long lever to painstakingly bend each sheet into a perfect arc. He bolted these arcs together, forming a half-cylinder, a Quonset-style shell, which he then fastened to the edges of his wooden platform. Now he had a single-skinned iron hut. As Jedediah Stone had pointed out, it would be a death trap, conducting the winter cold directly inside. But Balint was far from finished. He built a second, identical shell, but with a slightly smaller radius, and mounted it inside the first, leaving a 5-inch gap between them. This cavity was the heart of his invention. Day after day, the Kovach family worked to fill it. They dug clay from the riverbank, mixed it with water to the consistency of thick porridge, and then trampled in load after load of dried prairie grass. This was the ancient building material of the world: straw clay, cob, puddled adobe. It was heavy, cheap, and possessed of a remarkable property Balint understood from the kilns of his homeland: thermal mass. It was during this phase that Crandall Pickersgill made his official visit, delivering his warning about the improvement clause. He stood over Balint, who was on his knees, packing the damp mixture into the wall with his bare hands. "I'm telling you, Kovach, the land agent in Cheyenne won't approve this. A dwelling has to be affixed to the soil. It proves your intent to stay." Balint looked up from his work, his face calm. He gestured to the half-finished wall. "Mr. Pickersgill, this wall will weigh more than 3 tons when it is dry. My intent is to stay. The wheels are not for leaving. They are for turning." Pickersgill stared, uncomprehending. "Turning?" "The wind does not come from one place," Balint said, returning to his work. The conversation was over. Pickersgill left, convinced the man was not just a fool, but a stubborn one. The final element was the pivot. At the center of the platform, Balint fixed a massive iron pin salvaged from a broken hay rake. This pin slotted into a greased housing on the ground, anchoring the structure while still allowing it to rotate. With a long pole used as a lever, the entire 3-ton dwelling could be turned by one person to face any direction. He built a small, heavily insulated door at one end and a tiny, triple-glazed window at the other. By October, as the first cold winds began to scour the basin, the structure was complete. It was low, curved, and strange, an iron turtle on the vast, open prairie. While his neighbors stacked the last of their firewood high against the walls of their log cabins, Balint Kovach simply waited, checking the direction of the wind. The principle Balint Kovach had harnessed was one of the most fundamental in nature: aerodynamic deflection. His neighbors' cabins were designed to confront the wind, their flat walls acting like dams against a river of air. This confrontation was the source of all their problems. When wind hits a flat surface, its velocity drops to 0 and its kinetic energy is converted into pressure. This high pressure is a relentless force, an engine of infiltration that drives cold through every available opening. Balint's arch did the opposite. It did not confront the wind. It yielded to it. When the 40-mile-per-hour gales of the Bighorn winter struck the curved iron skin of his dwelling, they were not stopped. Instead, they were guided. The smooth, continuous curve offered no sharp angles or flat surfaces for pressure to build upon. The airflow remained laminar, splitting and flowing smoothly over and around the structure, just as water flows around a smooth river stone. The wind's immense energy was deflected, not blocked, and it therefore was not converted into pressure. The implications of this were profound. Without a high-pressure zone on the windward side and a low-pressure zone on the leeward side, the primary engine-driving air infiltration was eliminated. The air outside the arch and the air inside were at nearly the same pressure. There was no invisible force trying to ram cold drafts through the walls or suck warm air out. The only heat loss was through pure conduction, the slow molecular transfer of heat through the 5-inch straw clay wall. And that wall was a thermal battery. The dense mixture of clay and straw gave it enormous thermal mass. It took a long time to cool down and a long time to heat up. The small stove inside didn't have to fight a constant influx of frigid air. It only had to slowly feed heat into the massive walls, which then radiated that warmth back into the small living space for hours. A standard log cabin might lose 20,000 BTUs of heat per hour to air infiltration alone during a gale. Balin's arch, by killing the pressure differential, lost perhaps a tenth of that. He wasn't just living in a strange house. He was living inside a different set of physical laws. He hadn't built a better wall. He had built a better relationship with the wind. The winter of 1888 arrived not as a gentle slide, but as a sudden, violent blow. In mid-November, the sky turned the color of lead, and a blizzard buried the basin under 2 feet of snow. For the next 6 months, the world was a study in white and gray, punctuated by the ceaseless, scouring wind. Temperatures plummeted to 20, then 30 below zero, and stayed there for weeks at a time. The gales were the true test, howling out of the north for days on end, piling snow into drifts that buried fences and sheds, isolating each homestead in its own frozen world. For the families in the log cabins, it was a repeat of the familiar battle. The wind shrieked at the corners of Jedediah Stone's house, a physical assault that vibrated through the logs. They stuffed rags into every crack, but the fine stinging snow still found its way in, dusting the floorboards. Their woodpile, which had seemed immense in October, dwindled at a terrifying pace. Amos Fry's family essentially abandoned 2 rooms of their cabin, hanging heavy quilts in the doorways and living entirely in the kitchen, huddled around the stove. Inside the Kovacs arch, life was unnervingly normal. The first thing Balint did each morning, or whenever the wind shifted, was step outside and, using his long lever, pivot the entire house until its curved nose pointed directly into the gale. The effect inside was immediate. The sound of the wind, which had been a low roar against the side, softened to a smooth, deep hum, the sound of a river passing by. There were no drafts, none. A candle flame on their small table barely flickered. The air was still and quiet. Ilona found she could cook a stew on the stove, and it would actually simmer, not just fight to stay warm against the cold stealing its heat. The children, Janos and Zofia, played on the floor, which was made of thick planks laid over the insulated base. They wore sweaters, not their heavy winter coats. The 5 inches of straw clay acted as a massive thermal flywheel. A small, hot fire in the morning and another in the evening was enough to keep the interior temperature above 50 degrees, even when it was 30 below outside. The walls themselves felt cool, but not cold, to the touch. They were slowly, constantly radiating the heat from the stove back into the room. The most elegant proof of their success was a simple, domestic observation. Lard and bacon grease were staples of the frontier diet, kept in ceramic crocks. In every other cabin in the basin, these fats were frozen solid from November to April. A cook had to chisel or chip off a piece to use it. One evening, as Ilona was cleaning up, she wiped her greasy fingers on the curved inner wall of the arch, leaving a long, pale streak about a foot from the floor. She meant to wipe it clean, but forgot. The next morning, Balint pointed to it. The streak was gone. At the bottom of the curve, where the wall met the floor, was a small, translucent puddle of liquid grease. In a house where rendered fat refused to solidify, the victory over the cold was not just scientific, it was absolute. By late January, the winter had reached a new level of ferocity. A storm system stalled over the Rocky Mountains, and for 3 straight days, a blizzard of historic proportions raged across Wyoming. The wind did not gust. It was a solid, unrelenting force of over 50 miles per hour. The snow was not falling but flying horizontally, a blinding white wall that erased the world. Visibility was less than 10 feet. Crandall Pickersgill was caught out in it. As stock inspector, he felt a grim duty to check on the herds in the lower basin, convince the ranchers there were unprepared. It was a foolish decision born of pride and responsibility. 3 miles from his own ranch, his horse, a strong, reliable buckskin, stumbled into a deep, wind-scoured washout hidden by the snow and broke its leg. The crack of the bone was sharp and final, swallowed instantly by the roar of the wind. He had no choice but to put the animal down. Now he was alone, on foot, and already dangerously cold. He knew his own cabin was too far. The nearest landmark was the Kovat's claim. He hated the thought of seeking shelter from the mad Hungarian, but survival overrode pride. He pushed on, leaning into the wind, his face caked in ice, his bearings lost in the whiteout. The landscape was utterly alien, every familiar contour buried. He was beginning to succumb to the fatal lethargy of hypothermia when he saw it, a low, dark curve against the white, the only feature not yet completely swallowed by the drifts. It was the top of Kovach's arch, its nose pointed directly at him, perfectly aligned with the gale. It was the one unburied landmark in a world of white. He crawled the last 100 yards, his legs no longer working properly. The wind tore at him, trying to pry him from the earth. He reached the structure and collapsed against it, his body racked with shivers. He pressed his face against the iron. He expected a cold so intense it would feel like a burn, a cold that would steal the last of his life. He felt nothing. Not warmth, but the complete and utter absence of the biting, soul-stealing cold of the wind. It was just a surface, still and neutral. Disoriented, he fumbled with a frozen glove, pulling it off with his teeth. He laid his bare palm flat against the corrugated metal. It was shockingly, impossibly neutral. He slid his hand along the curve until he found a rivet head. He gripped it, and through the numbness in his fingers, he felt it. A distinct, undeniable, life-giving warmth. The rivet, a solid piece of iron passing through both layers of the wall, was conducting the heat from inside the house clear to the outside. It was a tiny beacon of thermal energy in a world of absolute cold. Somehow he found the strength to pull himself to the door. He hammered on it with his fist. It opened, and Balint Kovach pulled him inside. The transition was so sudden it was violent. One moment, he was in a screaming, freezing hell. The next, he was in a world of profound stillness and quiet warmth. The air didn't move. He could hear the blood pounding in his own ears. He saw Ilona at the stove, saw the 2 children staring at him with wide eyes. And on the floor, near the wall, he saw a small, glistening puddle of what looked like melted lard. He sank to the floor, the shivers overtaking him as warmth began to penetrate his frozen limbs. Balint wrapped him in a blanket and handed him a mug of hot coffee. Pickersgill sat there for a long time, saying nothing. just listening to the soft hum of the wind flowing over the shell of the house. He looked at the smooth, curved walls, then at the quiet, unassuming man who had built them. All his certainty, all his knowledge of what a house should be, had been dismantled in the space of a single, freezing afternoon. Finally, he looked at Balint. "You didn't build a house, Kovach," he said, his voice hoarse. "You built a wing. You taught it to fly without leaving the ground. When the great blizzard finally broke, and the spring thaw began to reveal the devastation of the winter, Crandall Pickersgill was a changed man. He had seen something that fundamentally altered his understanding of survival on the plains. He rode to Cheyenne, not as a stock inspector, but as an advocate. He stood before the territorial land agents, men like himself, men of rules and regulations, and he made his case. The Homestead Act, he argued, his voice ringing with the conviction of a convert, intends for a man to improve the land, to make it productive. Our current definition of a permanent dwelling is killing him. We demand he build a box of logs that fights the wind, and the wind is winning. He described Balint's arch, not as a strange contraption, but as a piece of sophisticated engineering. He explained the aerodynamics, the thermal mass, the simple genius of the pivot. "Kovach's dwelling is more permanent than any cabin in my district," he declared, "because it guarantees the survival of the family within it. Permanence is about people, not posts sunk in the ground." His position and his passion were persuasive. He drafted a new amendment to the Wyoming Settlement Code, creating a special classification for structures that used unconventional methods to achieve superior thermal performance. He called them movable thermal dwellings. The clause was revolutionary, officially recognizing that the solution to a frontier problem might not look like anything a frontiersman had ever seen before. By the following autumn, 3 more families in the Bighorn Basin, including Jedediah Stone, had built their own versions of the Kovach's arch, with Balint patiently teaching them how to bend the iron and mix the straw clay. The Wyoming Stock Growers Journal published a lengthy article on the design, complete with diagrams, heralding a new approach to winter survival. Balint Kovach's intuitive understanding of fluid dynamics anticipated modern building science by nearly a century. Today, architects and engineers use wind tunnels and computer modeling to design buildings that minimize wind load and pressure differentials. The principles of the Passive House Standard, a super-insulated airtight envelope that eliminates thermal bridging, are a direct descendant of the philosophy embedded in Balint's humble iron arch. He had created a high-performance home out of scrap metal, mud, and the wisdom of the wind. The great myth of the American West is one of conquest, of pioneers who broke the land and stood fast against the elements. Their cabins were symbols of that fight, fortresses of timber planted in defiance of the prairie wind. Balint Kovach brought a different wisdom, an older wisdom from the vast open plains of the Pusta. He understood that some forces are too great to be fought. They must be understood. He saw the wind not as an enemy to be defeated by brute force, but as a fundamental reality of the world, a power to be respected, accommodated, and even befriended. He didn't plant his house against the wind and dare it to strike. He taught it to bow. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering valuable, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of forgotten genius. What other modern scientific principles do you see reflected in old world techniques? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. The events, characters, and names presented are fictionalized for narrative effect, though they are inspired by real historical practices and principles of building science. Any application of these or similar techniques should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety standards, and regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.